Welcome back to Money in the Tank, episode 37. It's me, Arnie, tax professional, and
Brad, Generals and Startup guy.
Yeah. So we're missing Jolie this week with good reason. Not crook, he's just under the pump, so that's all right.
End of financial year for financial planners.
Yeah, that's it.
Pass.
So Brad and I are going to carry the torch, and as I like to do, as we all like to do with Money in the Tank, we're going to start off with Rivkin's rules. So we don't have the book handy because Jolie's got the OG book, but I've got a few quotes here. I'll read out a few, Brad. I'll give you a bit of value from Rivkin this week. We've got investing is often about whom you know and not what you know. Follow the winners in any field of endeavor. Never offer financial advice unless asked. Never offer any advice unless asked. And that's a perfect little segue into everything in this podcast is general in nature. And if you want some help with your affairs, you should seek professional advice.
Technically, people are clicking us to seek the advice, as in like to seek our opinions. Yeah. So we're not just throwing opinions at you.
This is educational. This is educational in nature, and we'll give our opinion on what we think, but you shouldn't take this as do not rely on our advice.
And Joel, outside of here, obviously financial planner can give financial advice, he's licensed to, but on this podcast not. But I think they're two of the most I would say rational pieces of quotes from Rivkin that I've heard in a while. So maybe we've got to stick to the internet to get quotes of Rivkin.
I got to cherry pick on the internet, whereas Jolie normally reads from the book. So he sort of goes up with a random approach, which I kind of prefer it because you get some really wild left field takes from Rivkin
sometimes. So today we're talking about a few things. So we're going to be focused today on a subject that I think everybody will be aware of, which is petrol prices and oil.
Yep.
But I think it's one of those commodities and resources that it's probably, honestly, the commodity that touches the most parts of our lives through the most parts of the supply chain, and one that not a lot of people actually know much about. Because unless you're really in the oil and gas industry, or you're one of those curious people like us, where you spend kind of tens and tens and hundreds of hours looking at this sort of stuff. It's actually fascinating, kind of watching the oil industry and how it changes and what's happened before doesn't necessarily mean what's going to happen in the future. We're going to be talking about kind of previous price hikes versus this price hike in terms of the barrel of oil. We're going to be talking about what is oil. We're going to be talking about what's it used for. We're going to talk about kind of forecasts around it. The impacts on inflation. And then, of course, there's always some good news in that stuff, right? There's always a way with any sort of economic change to benefit from it financially. So we'll give a few ideas around that one, possible ways of doing things.
Yep.
And also, there's, it might not be all doom and gloom in terms of, the change to renewables. So there is obviously a step back, but I think it's going to be one step back to go 2 steps kind of forward. So we'll be touching on that.
Yeah.
Arnie's going to be the crypto god today. So Arnie's going to be talking about all things crypto. Arnie's going to do a few surefire news, what's happened really, really quickly. Seach Tabone's back.
Beautiful. My favorite.
In a northern hemisphere country. But before we do Seach Tabone, I'm going to quickly have a chat as well around literally 2-3 minutes on the central bank meeting that's happening, or that just happened, between the US Fed, the ECB, and the UK's central bank, and kind of what come out of that. So without further ado, let's jump into the main topic today, and I'm just going to be sharing the screen. And guess, can you see that?
Yeah, that's good.
All safe and sound. Awesome. So for our listeners, I'm just showing a bit of an infographic around types of oil, light, heavy, and its uses. So through the refining process, all the different stuff that don't ask me what the middle column means. It's chemistry, not my forte. Around what C5 to C9 means, but basically you're looking here at heavy oil versus light oil, and generally for the listeners out there, light oil is generally found deeper in the ground. So when they drill kilometers into the ground, there's a higher chance of finding lighter oil, which is more expensive, it's easier to refine, And the reason why it's lighter is, and here's a fact for you, Arnie,
Mm.
is because the temperature in the Earth that surrounds it is about 70 to 80 degrees, and it actually kills a lot of the bacteria that eats the lighter enzymes in the oil. So that's why closer to the core of the Earth, lighter oil, better oil. Towards the top of the Earth, heavy oil, thick, and sometimes can only be used for things like bitumen on roads, for instance. But basically, the oil, what sort of products comes out of oil? So a barrel of oil can create bitumens. It can create roofing. It can create fuels for ships, factories, and central heating. And so traditionally, the reason why ships create so much of our CO2 emissions, and that's one of the areas, I think it's like globally between 7 and 10% is just on logistical ships. Reason why is because they're burning heavy, dirty oil. You then got your lubricating oils and waxes, your diesel fuels, which is really the bottom of what we use as consumers. You then start heading towards your jet fuel, so your high content, your petrol for vehicles. Then you got your chemicals. So then you've got your stuff that can go out there and anything petroleum-based, petroleum jelly, plastics, etc. And then right at the top, you got your liquefied petroleum gas. So we're just, I guess, today wanted to start off with about as basic as it gets, which is types of oil, what's it used for today. And then I think we're going to jump into production. Correct me if I'm wrong, Arnie, around...
Yeah, spot on, mate. I think what we'll do before we jump into the production and the analysis, I just also want to give the tankers a brief overview of OPEC, what OPEC is, how they affect the global oil industry. And I'll just keep it very high level because what you've described is perfect. It's gives the tankers an insight into all the different parts of our lives that oil touches. But there's also the second part of the equation, and it's, I guess, how oil is supplied and why the price is sometimes so high or low, depending on like what the global players in the oil market want to achieve. So OPEC, for those that aren't aware, stands for the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. So it's founded in 1960, and the founding members are Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. As of 2019, they had some additional countries join, and that was Qatar, Indonesia, Libya, United Arab Emirates, Algeria, Nigeria, Ecuador, Gabon, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, and the Congo. However, since then, a few of those states have dropped out of the OPEC membership. I can't remember exactly who it is. I think Indonesia dropped out. Qatar, perhaps, I think, dropped out as well. We can, we don't fact check on Money in the Tank, but if you want to go and fact check us, go have a look. Who is OPEC not? OPEC is not Russia, China, the United States. However, sometimes you might hear of people referring to OPEC plus a coalition. So OPEC plus a coalition is typically, well, actually, do we have that graphic on screen? We do. So OPEC plus a coalition is normally the countries that I mentioned, but also countries like Russia. So if you want to talk about how much of oil production per day is handled by the world, OPEC themselves account for about 35% of it. But if you include Russia, just Russia alone with OPEC, they account for over half the world's daily production. And Brad, if you've got the graphic there which shows the petroleum reserves, handy. And if you don't, it's fine.
No,
I can just
have it.
That's fine. I'll just state that the world's petroleum reserves, if you include OPEC plus a coalition of Russia and a few other countries, they account for about 80% of the world's oil reserves. So it's fair to say,
with Venezuela being the biggest reserve.
That's right. So it's, for lack of a better term, you might call OPEC a cartel. And basically, we can jump into the analysis now because we'll basically talk about what the implications are of that cartel.
Yeah, and I think one of the key things to be aware of on this graph, and for those tankers just listening, is the US, right? So back in 1984, the US was producing basically just behind the former USSR, the second biggest producer at 9 million barrels. And the US actually went all the way down to about 5 million barrels around 2008. And then something happened, which is fracking, and we will talk about fracking. But fracking is where they horizontally drill. So instead of vertical drill, they vertical, then horizontal. And they basically, under pressure, put a plethora of different chemicals underground, and what it does is actually crack the rock, makes it more porous, and it allows the basically retrieval of oil out of shales, which traditionally with a vertical well wouldn't be able to retrieve that oil. And just a difference in payback periods. I think the standard fracking well, fact check me, but pretty sure its lifespan's only about 2 to 5 years. Whereas your traditional vertical wells lifespans are 20 to 30 years. And so again, something that's very important to understand. But the cost of it also is much higher. But what fracking allowed America to do, and it was a great oil rejuvenation, they say, is America went from 5 million barrels of oil a day to actually the world's biggest oil and gas producer, producing up to 12 and currently around 11 to 12 million barrels of oil a day. They're number one, and they're a net exporter as well. And there's a bit about that which will come into a little bit when we start explaining about why prices are where they are and where they're heading. So just keep that in mind, tankers. America, number one. But OPEC, very powerful cartel. And America, barrel of oil out of the ground for fracking is about $60 a barrel on average to get it out of the ground. Saudi Arabia, about $8.
Yeah, and okay. just to give like some insight to the tankers, when people think oil, you think these major giant players, and like the ones that spring to mind straight away for me are like Exxon Mobil or Chevron, etc. Just to give you an example of what someone like an Exxon Mobil does, they're about 3% of the world's oil. So they are a huge company, and they obviously factor into that number that Brad was talking about in the USA. But in general, they do not control or wield as much power as OPEC plus the coalition. That's right.
And also people's perception of them. I think they think there's a lot more. It's all the midstream producers that produce the majority of the oil. But let's get into where we are kind of right now. So right now we've got on the screen from 2000 to 2021, 22, current, what the crude oil, basically barrel of oil is worth. And at the moment, it's at $109. And we've obviously come up from around $20 a barrel at the start of 2020. And there was actually a day in 2020 when a barrel of oil actually went negative. So they were paying people to actually take the oil. And real quick, that was just because of intermediary brokers were buying oil futures. Obviously, COVID hit. Suddenly, no more planes, no more cars. And suddenly there was all these brokers being told, okay, where am I delivering your 100 million barrels of oil? And they don't have big tanks. And so it was like the governments of America and stuff that ended up buying a lot of that oil for their strategic reserves. But, the government was getting paid up to $8 a barrel to actually take the oil because there was nowhere to put it. But it rebounded quite heavily, as you can see on the screen here. But we've rebounded from, $0 or $20 a barrel average to $109. But that's where we are today. I think one of the important things to look at is, okay, well, we've had higher oil prices. It hit about $140 a barrel back in July 2008. And it quickly dropped all the way down to $42 a barrel when the financial crisis really took hit and there was a global recession. There was no recession here in Australia. We got away with it. G20 country. Well done, Australia. But, there was a big fall from grace. And then we picked back up to basically higher than where we were today, 113. And that went for a few years. And then we went all the way down to about $50 a barrel, stayed around there, bottomed out at the start of 2020. And now we're back up. And so people are like, okay, well, is it just going to do that again? All prices here, just, let's use the word around inflation. Is it transitory high oil? How that go? But, or is there something else at play? And I think that's what we want to talk about today and pass on some of the information that I guess we know and we look into and research and hear about to the tankers so that you two can get across this information. And I do like looking at previous, because humans are creatures of habit, but we do adapt. And I think it's really, really important to understand what's changed in the oil environment over the last 15 years, because just because something's happened in the past doesn't necessarily mean it will happen again exactly the same way. And I think there's 3 to 4 major factors of why we're living in a different world, but why we are back where we are today. And it's funny, I was listening to a podcast yesterday of a share that I'm invested in, which is Melbana Energy. It's a specky in the ASX. I hold it, just letting everybody know. But I was listening to
General Nature,
but it's also been the highest performing ASX stock this year, so I'll take that as well. But basically, the CEO of that company was on a podcast, and it wasn't really talking about the first half of the podcast. Was nothing to do with the actual company itself that he's the CEO of. It was about how do we get here in oil prices, and it basically just cemented, I guess, the information that I've been reading over the past, probably decade, or especially the last few years. In that, even if we didn't have COVID, even if Russia and Ukraine didn't go to war, we would still be in a high oil environment. And there's reasons why that is. And I guess we're going to cover those off today. Just so you understand them. Obviously, the way that I think he explained Russia and COVID was an extra kick to the butt, even though you were already down the ground. So you just got an extra kick just to hurt a little bit more were these events. Because a lot of people believe that we have a high oil just because of Ukraine and Russia, or due to COVID and it's the different supply pressures that we've got. I guess the first point I want to talk about is we talked before around the oil producing of America and how it went from 4 million barrels to 12 million barrels a day. And you can't underestimate how big that is. Right?
A lot.
And it came from fracking. And what happened in fracking after that was basically about 350 billion US dollars was lost from investments made by Wall Street into the fracking business in America, because basically they're taking money and they'll just putting wells into the ground over and over and over, right, while the price was high. And we forget that the price of oil out of the ground in fracking was about $60 a barrel, average. And what happened, I guess, once OPEC, for instance, didn't necessarily like, and I mean, Arnie, you might want to talk about this bit around OPEC and the kind of geopolitics around oil and around them losing total control of the oil markets and not necessarily liking America's oil supply. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I'll talk about that a little bit. So basically what was happening is, as we mentioned before, OPEC operates like a cartel, and they basically want to try and control the price of oil and gas, but also try and control their market share. So when things like fracking took off in America, which was a different process for getting the energy, the hydrocarbons out of the ground, as Brad mentioned, it prompted OPEC and maybe OPEC plus coalition, however you want to describe them, to oversupply the market to try and keep the price very, very low. So therefore, those producers who were engaging in the fracking industry would not be able to sell their hydrocarbons for more than their cost. And I think, again, fact check me if I'm wrong, but I think, Brad, you were saying at the time, the average cost to produce those hydrocarbons through the fracking process is about $60 a barrel.
Yep.
So OPEC, with their massive production of oil per day, plus their control on the world's reserves, were basically selling at cost or for a loss, trying to drive those other producers into bankruptcy. And that graphic that Brad's showing there is bankruptcy filings compared to oil prices within the industry. So you can see in 2016, that blue part of the bar graph is
basically 50% of all companies going bankrupt in 2016 were oil companies.
That's right, engineered by OPEC plus the coalition. And then that sort of continued, like obviously not to the extreme that we saw in 2016, but until 2020, when COVID shut down the world economy and we saw again a huge oversupply, but with nowhere for that supply to go, it basically sort of forced the hand. And I think at that point in time, President Trump contacted OPEC, or I forget the name of it, but there's like a bloke who's like a representative of OPEC, and he's like the prince of somewhere, maybe the prince of Saudi Arabia. They call him MBS, which is his initials. And he basically said, is there a way that you guys can stop producing as much at this point in time to try and ease some of this pressure? And that's what occurred. They agreed, and then that OPEC spoke to Russia, and in conjunction they stopped. But then, as you've seen,
there was also
now,
some arms deals there.
just a casual arms deal.
$100 billion worth of arms going towards them.
Yeah, exactly. So then after that, like flip to today, and we've got a bit of maybe I'm putting the cart before the horse here, Brad, if you want to take back over, but you flip to today with the Ukraine war situation, and we've got an opposite basically, where as we mentioned in previous podcasts, the global economy has bifurcated, and just because of the huge amounts of hydrocarbons that Russia produces not being available to Western countries anymore, or not in the same quantities or amounts for political reasons, we're seeing the demand skyrocket, and that's essentially why the price is being driven up.
Well, one of the reasons.
One of the reasons,
and
yeah.
I think the flip side is Biden also had a chat to MBS and said, "Can you increase thing?" And MBS just gave the front fingers. So there's a lot of geopolitics involved in this, people. So there are definitely administrations in America that to say get along with OPEC countries like Saudi Arabia and that a lot more than other administrations. And in times when they're putting pressure on him due to Khashoggi and a whole bunch of other stuff, he basically wants free. I think he said he'll increase oil supplies if he gets free access to travel to America without any criminal intent and the rest of it. So a bit of stuff there. But let's go back to other reasons. So that's one reason, is that the fracking industry, after prices got artificially lowered due to oversupply, a lot of the fracking industry went away, so a lot of supply went away. And now that we've got increased demand, less supply, it goes up. That's one reason. Another reason is this. And so on the screen, everyone, I'm talking about our renewable energy generation. So for the tankers, not on video, watching us on YouTube, but listening, I've got our world data, a bit of a graph around 2000 and let's call it 2008, 2009, 2010, somewhere around there. Basically, the majority of the world renewable energy was like 99% hydropower. And then wind, solar, and other renewables pushed. So every one of us knows over the last 10, 15 years, there's been numerous accords, the Paris Accord, Copenhagen, numerous get-togethers of governments around the world to talk about global warming, and it's been front and center. I mean, it was front and center here in the Australian recent election. It was one of the reasons why a lot of the seats, went to independents, and basically with the charge of doing more around global warming and decarbonisation. But 2008, 2010, the world really did start turning on fossil fuel companies. Never really were friends with Main Street, but let's just say that investment went into renewables. The world was moving to renewables, and if you think about traditional oil wells, the vertical ones that I'm talking about, 20, 30-year paybacks, there wasn't that much incentive with low oil prices. Every government basically and person hating oil companies. Everyone's saying we're changing to renewables. We're trying to get there by 2030, 40, 50, somewhere around there. If you're sitting there as a CEO of a fossil fuel company, and your shareholders are, what you are running to around profitability, and you're going, well, is it best to put my assets in new wells, in my free cash flow? Is it best to pay it out as dividends? Is it best to pay it out dividends and maybe some renewable investment, right? At the moment, fracking companies and oil companies have learnt from the previous oil hike what can happen very, very quickly. And if they invested that money in 2000, let's go back to 2010, 2011, 12, when the oil price was high, they were dumping new money into new supply here. And you've got to remember that supply then came online. And by the time it's come online, because it takes generally anywhere between 5 to 10 years to plan a well, drill a well, turn it into production, etc. They'll bring on the wells in the mid 2015s when it was $40 a barrel. And so there wasn't necessarily any impetus to continue investing into new wells. And so, an article here, why are US companies not ramping up production to cash in on record oil prices? So instead of expanding production, companies are focused on shareholders and debt. They've taken a learning, because so many went bankrupt, and the ones that survived took the learning that, okay, well, we nearly went bankrupt last time we used all our free cash flow to just pump into new oil, bring new supply on and kill ourselves. Let's just keep the price high, lots of dividends. Let's make as much out of the oil that we can that's left. And I think the interesting one for me was this graph here. Same subject, but it shows that in 2019, this is what the investment was. It was about, call it $900 billion worth of investment into bringing new supply on. And so here is a quick graph showing if there's supply with no new investment, you see very quickly over the course of 10 or 20 years, we go from like 100 million barrels of oil a day down to about 20 million barrels of oil if we don't invest. If we invest into existing fields that we already found, we go from about 100 million barrels of oil a day, or 97 million barrels a day, down all the way down to 23 million, right? There is a constant, because oil wells produce and then they have a lifespan and they start heading down on a bell curve. There's a reason why we need to keep investing money every year and finding new fields and topping up oil. But because of renewables, because of low cost of oil, because of the learnings previously, and then because of COVID, we only invested about 600 billion in 2020, and I think 2021 was about 700. Basically, all up, we've underinvested 600 billion over the last 2 years in finding new oil supplies. But this goes back to 2013. Basically, I found out only yesterday. There's been an underinvestment in new oil because of the reason I stated since 2013. We should be spending about what we spent in 2019 if we want to basically meet our energy needs. Okay, so that's something to be aware of, that the under-investment in oil due to the renewables push, but the renewables not necessarily coming online and meeting as much of our energy needs as we probably forecasted it would. We're a bit too optimistic. We're in this little valley now. And due to obviously OPEC's killing of the fracking industry with lower prices, are the main reasons why we see ourselves today with high oil prices. Now, then you add in COVID, then you add in Russia, and you kind of see where we are. But with global oil demand, and this is not just one, this is SPG Global, but there's also EII, there's also a whole bunch of, I guess, global energy associations that look at our demand. Basically, oil is going to go from today, we produce, let's just say 100 million barrels. Natural gas and oil, I mean, they're to 2050, they're still going to be increasing the demand to, basically, we need more and more oil. And so they think it's going to peak around 160 million barrels. If we're spending less today and bring on less supply, but our demand for fossil fuels are going to keep going up because renewables aren't there, basic supply-demand curve, not enough supply, more demand, less investment into this space. The supply is not going to be coming on anytime soon. My personal opinion is that we are going to be in a high energy cost for the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, and it's highlighted, just to give you a little break here so you can gather your voice. It's highlighted by some of the recent news about, in particular in Europe, how they're trying to reverse some of the commitments or the policy decisions that they had in place to try and move away from fossil fuels. And this is obviously in the wake of them not being able to get as much hydrocarbons from Russia as they used to get. So Germany and Italy are two big users, but also because the price of those hydrocarbons has gone through the roof, right? So I can see there you've got the Bloomberg article on screen, and this is exactly what I'm talking about, how the G7 have basically started discussing a potential reversal of their commitment that would see them go back to using fossil fuels, so more gas, more coal. And there's even talk about potentially keeping some of the German nuclear power online for a bit longer, which was meant to be ending at the end of this year, I believe.
Correct. So, 3 nuclear power plants were supposed to be mothballed at the end of this year, and they're looking to keep those on. They're basically coal. So at the moment, Germany's looking at about 70 coal power plants coming on. And the G7 reversal, which we're talking about, was basically the G7 are the 7 biggest economies. I don't think China's in there, speaks in there. I mean, G7 is like a coalition. Is China in the G7, Arnie?
Mate, I will Google who's in the G7 because I know we're not. But
I know we're not. We fell out of it, and then we're in the G8. Now we're in the G20. But I know that Russia got kicked out.
So the G7: Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, UK, United States, and the European Union.
Call it the G7 of Western values. The 7 biggest Western values economies, but basically big. I mean, they represent probably, I don't know, G7, Arnie, Google it for me. G7's percentage of global economy. It
would be massive. I mean, just let's have a look at it. But
it seems like California would be like the 5th biggest country in the world by itself. I'm guessing.
Well, if you include Japan, United States, and the European Union in there, they are massive. So the aggregate gross domestic product of the G7 member states makes up 45% of the global economy in nominal terms. However, that's down from nearly 70% 3 decades ago.
Rise of Asia. But basically, the G7 got together and made a commitment of no more public financing of fossil fuels. And so to basically meet their carbon, renewable targets. That is now, and this is huge news that came out this week, they're now looking to reverse that because of renewables not being where they need to be. Then the Russian-Ukraine side of things, they need to find more fossil fuels. They know fossil fuels investment has been down, and they know that fossil fuels has to be one of the it's unfortunate, right? For the globe, but they know that for the next decade at least, a decade or two, we need to actually continue utilizing fossil fuels as an energy source. And so, look, all these points, people, there's a reason why I believe that we are going to be in a high energy environment because of the amount of time it takes to bring resources online. It's not a quick process. You don't just go out the back, dig a hole, or shoot a gun into the ground, Beverly Hillbilly style, and catch some Texas tea. It just doesn't happen. But I think what we can talk about is two things. One, there is silver lining for all the eco people out there that do care about the environment.
Which I would include you and I in that. Yeah,
I would definitely include myself in that.
Yeah.
I was a bit taken aback that the G7 was looking to reverse it, but what I guess this oil shock and change in geopolitics with Russia and Ukraine war and also the flow-on effects of deglobalization and the rest of it that's happening at the moment. I think it's made everyone realize how dependent we are on oil and gas and specific countries. I think it makes everyone realize the gap between renewables actually coming in and overtaking in 2050 was probably too far away.
Yeah.
And I think you're going to see a massive drive. So one good thing with high oil prices, and I know that it's bad that oil companies are making huge profits at the moment and will continue to do so, but they are at the moment dedicating between 40 to 60% of their profits to invest into renewables. And so if you were saying before they're making profits of 10 billion and now they're making profits of 50 billion, it's a $4 billion a year versus a 25, $30 billion a year investment into renewable change. And so we will ramp up our renewables much quicker, and the cost of wind and solar has gone right down. And so what I believe is going to happen through more public investment, more private investment from these oil companies because they've got more profits, not just dividend payouts, is that we are going to actually move quicker to utilizing renewables as our main energy source.
I agree.
I just think the next 5-10 years is going to be this cutover period. It's going to be a lot more painful than, there's always talk about the cutover was never going to be smooth. And I just think we're now we're in that bit, which is there's not enough of this to do this. And we're going to be there for a while, but eventually we'll come out the other end.
And just touching on what you just said and speaking of if we throw back to the start of this podcast, you made a very salient point, which was always ways to take advantage of changes in economic circumstances. And that is one of them. So looking at who is investing in renewables for the future, what the long-term horizon is, but also another point, and this is general in nature again, so please do your own research, but Rolls-Royce out of England, who not many people know, no longer deal in cars. They deal in air travel, space travel, and energy. And they have an interesting project, which is the small modular nuclear reactor project. So I don't know if you're aware of this, but it's I think they've been slated by the UK government that they've commissioned X amount of these small modular nuclear reactors, which are meant to be a safer, more efficient, and faster nuclear reactor, which they can set up in a fraction of the time of a traditional nuclear power plant. So it's part of the equation, and I'm not saying it's a good investment. But there are other players in that industry.
There are other players. These ITER coming online. It's supposed to come online in 2020, which is, for those that want to go and Google it, ITER, the world's biggest capital project ever undertaken, basically looking at nuclear fusion and getting more energy out than putting in.
I've read about that. That's amazing.
I've been tracking for 20 years, literally since I was a teenager, and it's going to be coming online around 2030. It is only but these other projects like in China and the UK, which use lasers instead of using tokamak to keep the plasma in there. I'm not going to go into the scientific details, but there are there's also thorium, the first thorium reactor coming online in China and France via a JV. Thorium is an alternative to uranium, and the only reason we don't have thorium reactors instead of uranium reactors and nuclear is because of the nuclear industry, and we need a nuclear, basically enriched uranium to make nuclear bombs, but we don't need that anymore because we've got enough of them, and so thorium is a very, very safe. So there is a lot of very, very promising technologies, both nuclear, thorium, nuclear fusion, using kind of lasers or tokamaks with deuterium coming on. But
could be a great spin-off episode for us to do a bit of a deeper dive into some of those alternative energy sources.
I think it's a great idea because they're great, and these companies doing great stuff now, right? That we could be investing in. But where can you also make some money? Or if you're interested in, if you believe the thesis and you did your own research and you believe that we are in for some profitable times around oil. 3 biggest producers in Australia: Woodside Petroleum, Santos, and Beach Energy. With Karoon down there, but Woodside Petroleum obviously recently took on all the BHP, their merger with BHP's oil and gas assets.
Mm-hmm.
I think later this year they're going to be merging, but they're going to be the biggest. They produce, can't remember, but basically their market cap's about 30 billion. Santos, market cap about 24 bill, and Beach Energy right down the bottom, about 3.5 bill. But they're our 3 biggest producers in Australia. And as I mentioned before, there's a whole bunch of speckies, with the one that I'm looking at being Melbana. They're currently drilling in Cuba, and it's a fossil, and they're doing that with Sonangol. And so it's a totally new field, Block 9. And so look, go out there, have a look. If you think this is like a thesis or hypothesis that you believe in, there's a whole bunch of speckies, and there's a whole bunch of producers in Australia. Obviously not as mature as some of our overseas competitors like ExxonMobil and Royal Dutch Shell and Gazprom and all the rest of it, but or Aramco, but which is a Saudi oil company, national oil company, which they sold 5% of and listed. But there are some producers out there, and it's certainly part of my portfolio. Again, I'm just putting my hand up and saying I moved about 10% to 15% of my cash into resource stocks over the last probably 6 to 12 weeks. So just be aware of that one.
Good wrap up. I think in terms of the format, perhaps I will do my rapid fire news items first, just to give you a bit of a break before you jump into.
And I might do sound about. I mean, we're looking at. I think we're looking at about 40, 45 minutes. We've done a big oil play. And so maybe we'll I'll do my central bank overview. Spend about 5 minutes on it next week. And Santa Bono was in Shanghai, but I'm sure Santa Bono can be in Shanghai next week talking about the Chinese stock market and what's going on over there at the moment. But
Santa Bono goes where he wants.
I think a bit of a crypto. Yeah, Santa Bono does what he wants with a red hat. It's just like, everywhere. But I think Arnie, bit of crypto and news roundup. Let's pump it out.
So I won't do coin market cap, but feel free to bring it up on the screen while I talk about this, Brad. So there's a few interesting news items this week, and there's actually a few big crypto news items. So one of the biggest ones is that the SEC in America has rejected Grayscale's spot Bitcoin ETF application. So a lot of people are very interested in this. I know you and I have spoke about it. I think you and I spoke about it.
And I think they've said they're going to be taking them to court over it, was what I was hearing, if they got rejected. Now they have been rejected. Are they, Arnie?
Well, they haven't. There's no response as yet.
Ooh, 2 hours ago.
Yeah, it's pretty new. So
Grayscale launches legal challenge.
Oh, they have done it. Okay, so interesting. And then off the back of that, just some other interesting crypto news. Coinbase is registering in Italy, Spain, France, and the Netherlands. And the news, which I think you touched on last week, or maybe you didn't touch on this one specifically, but the crypto hedge fund 3 Arrows has been liquidated. So planned sales, including holdings in their crypto startups. And then crypto exchange CoinFlex probably will not resume withdrawals on Thursday as planned. So those were my massive crypto news items this week. So some very interesting things taking place in the crypto space.
And XRP SEC is coming very much to a head over the next few months, I think. I know it was supposed to be in April, But when the judge back in, I think April, May, rejected the SEC's motion for reconsideration, and Hyman stuff came into it, we're going to see some big kind of, I'd say, and then in the, I think I mentioned last week, you had the new legislation getting passed around the US Senate at the moment on crypto, which is bipartisan in nature, and it's saying to move the regulation from the SEC to more the currency asset controls. And I think so. You got a lot of I guess political pressure now against the SEC around crypto, and you've got huge court cases going on with like XRP, with like the spot ETF with Grayscale. And so SEC is under the pressure. Gary Gensler.
Gensler. And one other, Gensler, whatever his name is, one other big point I forgot to mention, European Parliament says EU negotiators have reached agreement on the transfer of funds regulation on anti-money laundering rules for crypto specifically. So that will be interesting.
Yeah, what's the EU? They've been doing a lot of stuff. I think I mentioned they've got a big bill in at the moment. And I think the money laundering part of it is just part of that. So there's a lot of stuff happening at the moment.
All right, I'll do this part more rapid fire because this is non-crypto. Japan motor vehicle output posts 8% month-on-month decline in May. Japan government says production is weakening.
Wow.
Russia's Putin. I don't rule out tensions will emerge in our relations with Finland and Sweden after they decided to join NATO. Putin again, quote, there is no use setting an end date to the special military operation in Ukraine, which is what he's calling it. NATO's Stoltenberg has said China's growing assertiveness has consequences for the security of the NATO allies. Standard & Poor's now sees China economy expanding 3.3% this year versus the prior 4.2% view. Standard & Poor's still economic momentum should protect the US economy from recession in 2022. So they're saying we're not going to see a recession. Standard & Poor's extremely
high. I'll talk about next. I'll touch on that a bit more out of the recent central bank stuff and why they think possibly that America escapes.
Okay. And then S&P, extremely high prices damaging the purchasing power in the US. US welcome major changes in attitude from OPEC Plus. That is topical. Hochstein can release more SPR releases after October in US talks with OPEC nations that have capacity. Pardon me. Sorry about that. And US crude production rose to 12.1 million barrels per day in the last week, the highest since April 2020. And then Iran's top Iranian EU nuclear negotiators are meeting. And as is promised, Elon has been absent from Twitter for the last 8 days.
What? 8 days? That going on there and not being the center of attention?
No activity, no tweets, no likes.
Interesting. What's he doing behind the scenes, Arnie?
Well, people are speculating that there might be but focusing very hard on issues to do with Tesla, but also focusing very hard on issues to do with Starlink because they've got some court action against, I forget who it is exactly, but someone in America is trying to block Starlink from using bandwidth for providing internet and trying to get it recategorized so that the particular wavelength that Starlink uses would not be available to Starlink or the users. And there's potential that he's working very hard on multiple issues across his multiple companies.
I'm glad that he's off Twitter. That's a good thing. Because I mean there was lots of legal races across against more the ability to look out to space, and I know they fixed those with dampening stuff and the rest of it. But I mean I think the 5G Dish 5G plan will make Starlink unusable, and there's a whole bunch of stuff there with the FCC and bandwidth users and all the rest of it. Papa Elon, there you go.
To get him in every news.
And I think the only last one I'll say is Australian sales up 1% in May, which is actually double what was forecasted, and showing kind of quite resilient to interest rate changes at the moment. So watch this space. That's 6 months in a row of sales going up across the country. So, but I think on that note, we will. Thank you for the crypto news there, Arnie. I think you were across more crypto than I was this week. Thank God, you Shib God.
The Sultan of Shib, baby.
The Sultan of Shib. Well, everybody, I think that wraps up about 45, 50 minutes. I know a large portion of it was oil and a deep dive. Please let us know in the comments or get back to us individually around, these sort of episodes. If you find this educational, we are education in nature, but more focused education sessions covering a topic from broad angles. If you find it interesting and you want more of it, let us know.
Yeah, and you can get us at Money in the Tank on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram to give us any of those comments, likes, suggestions, and please subscribe to us. And I do have a 50-50 for us this week, Braddles, just in case. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so 50-50 I'll ask you this week.
Sure.
Would you rather have telekinesis, so the ability to move things with your mind, or telepathy, the ability to read minds?
Telekinesis, because I believe that with a high amount of EQ, it's very easy to read minds and body language, but it's not so easy to move objects with your brain. So I'll take telekinesis.
I think I would also take telekinesis, and for a different reason. I wouldn't want to be bombarded with the thoughts of other people.
Because these thoughts that are internal thoughts, right? And you can sometimes read that or, guess be based on responses or body language, what people are thinking. But if you actually had telepathy and you had the inner thought, you may make a different assumption than actually is there. And there's a lot of stuff that goes on inside people's heads. Would you really want to go into that? I think who was it? Jean out of X-Men, when she starts getting overdosed with all the thoughts of people's problems and everything, she goes insane. So
That's it.
I'll take telekinesis every day of the week.
You and me, and we can pretend to be Jedis.
Exactly, every day of the week.
Or actually be Jedis.
Yeah. No, actually be Jedis. Tankers, I hope you have a great weekend. This will be out on Fridays, as we have been sticking to.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, any comments? Arnie's already mentioned where to put them. Hopefully you earn your subscription if you haven't subscribed already on YouTube or other platforms. And see you next week, where Big Jolly will be back.
See you next week, everyone.
See yous.